Hi everyone, this is part 2 of the debts study for the paper 3, Britain. So we have Chartism from 1838 to 1850. So we've got 3 questions again. How far had the Chartists achieved their aims by 1850? To what extent did Chartist support change in the years 1838 to 1850? And how effective was the government's response to the Chartist challenge? So we have our first question. How far had Chartists achieved their aims by 1850? So we have what factors led to the emergence of the Chartist movement in the 1830s. August 1838, 6 points of the People's Charter was approved at the meeting of radicals in Birmingham. The Charter was concerned with political reform, which consisted of universal male suffrage, secret ballot, constituencies of equal sizes, abolition of property qualifications for MPs, payments of MPs and annual parliaments. These proposals weren't new, as universal suffrage can be linked back to the head of proposals in 1647, when army leaders met to discuss how the country should be more governed after the 1640 Civil War. The working class interest in reform was revived in the 1820s, and middle class organisations such as the BPU gained widespread working class support and were instrumental in securing the passage of the Reform Act of 1832. Now we have the Irish Coercion Act of 1833. So the Catholic Relief Act of 1829 had freed Catholics from most of their civil disabilities, allowing Irish Catholics to turn their attention to attacking the payment of tithes to the Anglican Church of Ireland. There were many violent clashes between farmers and the police forces, and breakdown of law and order compelled the government to act. The Irish Coercion Act, one of the most repressive legislations in Ireland of the 19th century. So Lord Lieutenant even was given wide powers to suppress any public meetings. Arbitrary arrests became commonplace, and offenders were tried by martial courts rather than in civil courts. Severity of the act shocked radicals throughout Britain. They feared that if Whigs were prepared to act so harshly in Ireland, they might be ready to impose similar restrictions on British radicalism. There were demonstrations against the acts throughout England and Scotland. Mass meetings in Birmingham, Nottingham and Manchester marked the first stage of revival of radical activity, which had been dominant for many years and a significant factor in the emergence of Chartism. We then have the Whigs and the trade unions. So the repeal of the Combinations Act in 1824 led to a re-establishment of many trade unions. 1834, Owen established the GNCTU, intending to bring together workers from across the country to create a single national union, whose powers would be enhanced by a substantial membership. Whigs took firm action against the GNCTU and destroyed it within 6 months. 6 farm labourers in Dorset agreed to form a secret trade union and swore an oath to keep their activity secret. The government considered secret oaths to be a crime. Men were duly convicted and sentenced to 7 years transportation. Led to a national outcry with the widespread protests in London and chief manufacturing towns, and 800,000 strong national petitions were presented to Parliament. Their sentences were cancelled within 3 years and men returned home, but the damage had been done. The GNCTU was no more and small unions continued as before. The government's determination to limit power of trade unions was confirmed by the Glasgow Weaver Strikes for 1837, led to 18 leaders of Spinners Union being tried on various charges and sentenced to 7 years transportation. These attacks on the trade unions intensified the hatred felt by working people towards the Whig government and were also a significant factor to the growth of Chartism. Then have the War of the Stamp. So from 1831 to 36, 1830s, every copy of the British newspaper had been taxed by 4 pence, making the press far too expensive for normal people. 1831, Hetherington found the Poor Man's Guardian, which was unstamped and sold for 1 penny, and within 2 years the Guardian had a weekly circulation of 220,000 copies. The government tried to stop Hetherington from publishing the newspapers, but fines, imprisonment and destruction of his printing press didn't deter him. Thanks to the sustained pressure from Hetherington and other radicals, that the government reduced the stamp tax on newspapers to 1 penny in 1836 and abolished the tax on pamphlets altogether. Success of this movement revealed that a coordinated campaign of extra parliamentary pressures could force a change into government policies, emboldening those hoping for some form of political reform, especially the leading radicals such as Lovett. Hetherington joined Lovett in 1836 to help draw up the People's Charter. The Factory Act of 1833. During the 18th century, many protests were government regulation of factory system, focusing their attention on long hours worked by adults and children alike. 1830, Richard Oyster began his reform campaign in a letter making a powerful argument comparing the conditions for slaves with plantations overseas with what he called the Yorkshire slavery. He organised a number of short-time committees in Yorkshire and Lancashire that campaigned for a 10-hour day for all factory workers. The strength of this movement led to Whigs to try and neutralise the committees by proposing charges of their own. Under the Act, it meant that factory owners couldn't employ children under the age of 9, and those aged 9 to 18 could only work for a maximum of 12 hours. Child workers were given some education. The short-time committee hoped that the legislation would be introduced to regulate adult employment, but this had never been the Whigs' intention. They hoped a limited reform aimed at improving the young people would weaken the appeal of the 10-hour movement overall. Many committee members joined the Chartist movement, believing that the political reform would make it possible to take action to legislate improve factory conditions. So we have the Poor Law Amendment Act 1834. The Poor Law Amendment Act was a harsh British welfare reform that abolished outdoor cash relief and forced the destitute into oppressive prison-like workhouses to deter poor from seeking aid. This legislation served a massive catalyst for Chartism as a working-class movement for political reform because the working poor viewed the new Poor Law as a cruel, elite-driven assault on their survival and dignity. Since the Act had been passed by a newly reformed Parliament that still denied working-class men the right to vote, millions realised that social and economic justice could only be achieved by gaining political power. Consequently, widespread fury over the workhouse system directly fueled the Chartist movement, uniting working-class communities under the demand for universal male suffrage to repeal the hated law. We now have the creation of the Chartist movement 1836 to 38. So the LMWMA, London's Men Working Association, was formed in 1836 by William Lovett, and it was intended to be a mass organisation of London working classes, having a small membership of a few hundred politically aware artisans such as tailors and craftsmen, charging fairly monthly for a membership of 1 shilling. The LMW's conservative outlook was a reflection of its modern ambitions, which included the promotion of political and social rights, especially the development of educational opportunities for all. Lovett believed that their aims could be achieved by organising political protest on moral force, which would persuade Parliament to embrace social and political change. May 1837, Lovett and his radical colleagues drafted a series of proposals that became the People's Charter in 1838. The LMWA believed that their enactment would inevitably lead to social and economic improvements. However, the LMWA would only be effective if it gained widespread national support. We then had the BPU. So Thomas Attwood's BPU had been a strong organisation of the middle and working class people that had campaigned in support of the Reform Bill in 1831-2. He played a vital role in the agitation in the favour of the bill, but it had been declined in importance once the Reform Act had been passed into law. Attwood recognised that the BPU in 1837 in response to the depression that hit several Midland towns in that years. At first, the BPU failed to secure the widespread support because of its modest demands, focused on household rather than universal suffrage. November 1837, Attwood relaunched the movement on a more radical programme. He intended that a new set of proposals would be presented to Parliament, backed by a huge petition. There was a dramatic turnaround in the fortunes of the BPU, and it rapidly won thousands of supporters with a programme that closely resembled the LMWA. Have the GNU, so this was led by O'Connor, and he founded the Northern Star in 1837, which had a circulation of 10,000 in 1837, rising over to 50,000 in 1839, when it gave its full support to the Chartist movement. This was a reflection of O'Connor's support nationally. By 1838, 3 distinctive regional organisations that pursue the same objectives, so obviously the BPU, the GNU and LMWA. So 1838 in May, LMWA and the BPU met up of 200,000 people where they agreed to join forces and adopt a common force. Lovett disapproved of O'Connor as he was a more of a physical Chartist rather than a moral force Chartist, which is then when he decided to move to the GNU. So we now have the importance of the National Convention in 1839. So once the People's Charter and the National Petition were adopted in 1838, and the Chartists began to organise meetings through the country to elect delegates to Chartist Convention, which was met in February of 1839 in London. These meetings were attended by thousands of men, women and children. One of the largest meetings was held at Kersal Moor outside Manchester in September 1838. Estimates of the numbers attending varied widely from O'Connor's exaggerated figure of 1 million to a more realistic of 50,000. Stevens said that Chartism was a knife and fork question, seeing Chartism as a straightforward response to the economic depression and therefore largely driven by social and economic conditions. However, Chartism was viewed very differently across the country. Lovett and the LWMA saw the People's Charter primarily as a political document reacting to the limitation to the Reform Act and policies of the Whig government. Many supporters in the Midlands, influenced by the BPU traditions of the early 1830s, were motivated by more economic concerns such as wage levels and achievement of universal suffrage. When the National Convention met in London in 1839, these divisions became more obvious. The convention was not made up of solely working class men. Many delegates were shopkeepers, tradesmen, doctors and newspaper editors. Delegates agreed that Parliament was unlikely to accept the national petition but disagreed about what action should follow its rejection. Some supported peaceful protests including exclusive dealings and the boycott of shops and trades whose owners opposed Chartism. Others supported the idea of a sacred month or general strikes that carried out the possibility of using violence and force. The convention faced a dilemma common to many radical movements, whether to use peaceful pressures or more forceful methods. Lovett and his supporters favoured moral force, using peaceful pressures to consider the Charter, whereas O'Connor and his supporter favoured ulterior measures, implying physical force as the violent action for the ulterior measure. These differences led to the division between moral and physical force of the Chartists. In July 1839, Chartists held a meeting in Birmingham Bullring, defying a ban imposed by local magistrates. The government avoided using local troops because it feared a repeat of the Peterloo massacre in 1819. Instead, it sent the police force from London via the newly opened London and Birmingham Railway. The meeting was dispersed after fighting between protesters and police. Lovett's prompting, the convention condemned the police action, leading to Lovett's arrest and imprisonment. We now have the Newport Rising in November 1839, so John Frost led one of the 3 separate marches that totalled over 10,000 men and converged onto Newport on the 3rd of November. They surrounded the Westgate Hotel where troops were holding several Chartists under arrest. It wasn't clear which side fired the first shots, but troops responded immediately in the crowd and quickly dispersing the mob. Order was restored into the town, but 22 men were found dead and over 50 injured. In the aftermath of the riots, Frost and 2 associates were found guilty of high treason and sentenced to death. However, fearing further rioting, the government ensured that the men were not executed, but were sentenced to transportation for life. The rising only strengthened the government's views that the Chartism was an organised committed to violent overthrow of the state. You then have the Chartist petition of 1839. So by June 1839, a massive national petition had been prepared, and the MP Atwood was persuaded to present it to Parliament. The document was 3 miles long and contained 1,283,000 signatures, 1/4 being women. As the House of Commons prepared to consider the petition, large public demonstrations were held throughout the country in an attempt to persuade the MPs to accept the documents. The Home Office, anticipating widespread riots, recruited large numbers of special armed constables. So on July 14th, the House of Commons voted on this petition and was treated as an undisguised contempt. Fewer than half of all MPs voted, and the petition was rejected by 235 to 46 votes. August 1839, National Convention was in disarray. Its numbers had dwindled dramatically. The BPU worked by the violence at the Bullring and withdrew its support. The convention considered a proposal to carry out the sacred month and the strikes associated with it. By September, many of the leaders, including Lovett, went to prison and the convention was dissolved. Over the next few months, the government went against Chartism and was in danger of complete disintegration. Throughout the agitation of the first petition, Chartists had acted in a lawful fashion with the use of physical force at Newport. The second petition in 1842, so unemployment was widespread with several towns experiencing mass unemployment. The new poor law hadn't been designed to cope with such extreme conditions. In many towns, it simply broke down under the strain, leading to severe hardship for many families. The petition contained 3.3 million signatures, a third of the adult population, and its largest single petition that had ever been laid before the Parliament. Despite this impressive achievement, it was again rejected by the House of Commons with 287 votes to 49. In the Plug Riots of 1842, so Chartists' response to their second defeat was influenced by the economic conditions. Wage reductions in the cotton trade sparked a wave of strikes known as the Plug Plot, which involved protesters emoting plugs from boilers and bringing factories to a standstill. O'Connor denounced the strikes at the Northern Star. Violent activity in the North as a whole was widespread but short-lived. The 1842 harvest was a good one, and towards the end of the year, unemployment began to fall and trading conditions improved. So the third Chartist petition of 1848 was a mass meeting planned for the 10th of April to be held in Kennington Common. O'Connor hoped that a massive crowd would support the petition, but by driving the rain and display of the force by the government deterred many. Only 25,000 turned up rather than the 200,000 he'd hoped for. Home Office prepared for the meeting by stationing 8,000 soldiers around London, enlisting up to 150,000 constables. O'Connor persuaded the meeting to disperse while he and a handful of supporters took the meeting to Parliament in a cab. His claimed 5.5 million signatures even turned out to be fewer than 2 million genuine signatures. The claimed signatures of the Queen and Wellington and invented names only made Chartism a laughing stock. Once again, the House of Commons refused the petition. Though Chartism was ridiculed, it didn't collapse, as in May in London attracted a crowd of 60,000 in other parts of the country, showing significance of the Chartist activity. This led to rumours that Chartism was going to become revolutionary, so the police and troops were deployed in large numbers throughout the northwest, and London saw a substantial police presence for the rest of the year. By early 1894, it was clear Chartism had no longer attracted a strong allegiance amongst the working people, and it faded into insignificance. The 1848 petition ruined O'Connor, and he was unable to regain his popularity. 1858, final Charters convened, and pressure for reform became largely preserved for the middle-class radicals such as John Bright. We now have the role of Lovett and O'Connor. There is quite a bit, but I've tried to simplify it as much as I can. So it's the National Charter of 1840. Within the collapse of the National Convention, Chartism had lost its one organisation that given its leadership and fundamental reorganisation. But the demand soon grew for a revived central organisation. O'Connor was ideally placed to assume that the leadership of Chartism. He was very popular in the north of England. He had sustained the Chartist message throughout the Northern Star, and his popular journalism meant that he was regarded by many as natural successor to William Cobbett. National Charter Association, NCA, was formed on these lines in 1840 and gave central direction to the movement for the rest of the decade. Within 2 years, it established 400 associations, required subscription from its members, and could boost a membership of 70,000. The NCA soon came under O'Connor's firm leadership. O'Connor remained wedded to the guiding principle of promoting the Charter in its entirety. His attitudes along with his uncompromising manner provoked widespread opposition from other Chartist leaders. He was released from prison in August 1841 and celebrated his release with a triumphant national tour within the NCA growing in influence and confidence. O'Connor proposed a second petition presentation to Parliament, national petition. He called for a new convention to meet in 1842 where it would arrange for petitions presentation to Parliament. So now we have a Lovett and the Chartists. So he had been imprisoned for the seditious in 1839 after the Bull Ring, the riots in Birmingham. During his time in jail, he focused his attention not on the People's Charter but on educational activities. He became convinced that education was the key to industrial advancement and would help the very poorest in society. After his release in 1840, Lovett formed the National Association promoting the political and social improvement of the people, which was dubbed Knowledge. So Chartism, which was dubbed Knowledge, Chartism by his opponents. Lovett's initiative was not supported by many local organisations or by the most of the Chartist leadership. O'Connor denounced the NA, but because he felt it was a distract from Chartism from the central focus of the People's Charter. Lovett persevered with the movement, but it was poorly funded and failed to gain very much support. By late 1850s, the NA had faded into insignificance. O'Connor and the Chartist plan. Chartism had made very little progress after 1842 because the combination of factors removed many Chartist sources of discontent. A general economic revival, a series of good harvests, relieved much economic pressures on working people. Moreover, unlike the Whigs, Peel's government of 1841-6 did not pass any legislation around Chartist anger. Several of his policies were broadly welcomed. Reduced duties on imported corn and other goods proved to be very beneficial to consumers. Peel also showed a strong humanitarian instinct. After 1842, Chartist activity began to fragment, as leading Chartists took up issues such as religion, temperance, and involvement in local government. O'Connor opposed single issues associations because he viewed them as a distraction to the essential aims of the People's Charter. However, he realised that Chartism needed to promote one concern that would reunite Chartism and rekindle its radical enthusiasm. His solution was the Chartist land plan. O'Connor had been working on plans that would remove workers from town and resettle them small farms and countryside. At the convention of 1845, he unveiled his Chartist land plan. You now have, why did the working class fail to achieve its aims by 1850? Divided working class. So they failed to gain support of aristocrats of labour, the highly paid and skilled craftsmen, and the growing numbers of engineers and other skilled men working on railway networks. It was never able to secure the allegiance of a large number of agricultural labourers in the country. Most villages were small and isolated, making coordinated action impossible. Working class division became more acute in the 40s when Chartists were diverted into other masses. The Rochdale pioneers established the first shop of what would become a national cooperative movement in 1844, and the teetotal movement gained widespread support, especially amongst women. These developments dismayed O'Connor, whose guiding principle was to focus on the Charter to the exclusion of other issues. Then we had the trade unions. So Chartism failed to gain support from the trade unions, as they were primarily focused on improving wages, working hours, and working conditions, rather than political reform. After the collapse of the GNCTU in 1834 and the transportation in the martyrs, unions were cautious about provoking government repression. Though some supported Chartism and attended the meetings, such as Curzon Moore, they refused to back the proposed Sacred Month general strike in 1839, facing severe consequences. During the 1840s, the National Charter Association and later O'Connor attempted to build closer links with the growing trade union movement, but these efforts largely failed. As trade union membership expanded and the organisations such as National Association of United Trades were formed in 1845, unions increasingly concentrated on economic issues rather than charters and political aims, using the movement without their sustained support. And a changing economy. So this links back to Stephen's question, or the knife and fork question. It was the blow and revolt of hunger that Chartism claimed support, but Chartism was more than a reaction to the prevailing economic conditions, as they saw political power as a factor of fundamental importance, believing that if the working class had a share in this power, then measures like the poor law wouldn't be needed and factory owners wouldn't have to produce wages. So sorry this is taking so long, but this is actually the end to our first question out of 3. So was Chartism a failure? Chartists failed 3 times to achieve their fundamental aims as Parliament's acceptance of the People's Charter. However, Chartism had important immediate and long-term significance on the impact of working class radicalism, as it breathed new life into working class radicalism after the decline of following Peterloo and disappointment of the 1830-32 reform agitation, allowing a new and often impressive leadership to emerge, strengthening an entire separate working class culture. Many men and women were involved in political activities for the first time, and activities included local gatherings, meetings and demonstrations. Speeches of O'Connor increased political awareness, and the Northern Star further political education and highlighted its movements as a national importance. Long-term legacy political involvement did not disappear in 1850, as the 1850s and 60s saw a growth of trade unions, cooperative societies and Sunday schools, and many prominent Chartists helped form the Liberal Party in the late 1850s. Most of the 6 points were eventually adopted, such as the property of qualifications to be abolished in 1858, secret ballot in 1872, and payments of MPs in 1912, and universal adult suffrage in 1928. Constituencies' boundaries are regularly redrawn. Annual Parliament had never been so seriously considered, and the overall assessment can be described as Chartism as a bitter discontent grown fierce and mad, better understood as a part of a long-term continuing of working class action from the 1790s through the 1830s and 40s and into the unionism and socialism of the 1880s and beyond. So we're finally moving on to question 2. So to what extent did Chartist support change in the years 1838 to 50? So there are wide variations in levels of support, and its heights of agitation changed, where mass meetings and torchlight processions in the North and Midlands attracted large and enthusiastic crowds of supporters. National support, however, declined during the 40s, despite the growing number of signatures claimed by 1842 and 48 petitions. The circulation of O'Connor's North Star is an important indication to Chartism fluctuating support. 1838 circulation of 10,000, but mass agitation of 1839, its editions on average of 36,000 copies. Popularity fell during the 1840s, selling fewer than 6,000 copies in 1845. 1851, the Star was struggling to reach 1,500 sales. National support. Chartism enjoyed strong support in expanding industrial areas such as the Midlands and the North. There were well-organised local associations in textile districts of Manchester and the surrounding towns. Ashton, Underlyer and Stockport in particular had a vigorous Chartist presence. There were areas where agitation against the poor law had been strong, and organisation skills developed by the anti-poor law associations were put to good use in sustaining the Chartists. The movement was especially strong in those textile trades such as handloom weavers, where livelihoods were threatened by technological change. Industrial areas in Scotland were also strong supporters of Chartism, especially after the government's suppression of Glasgow weaver strike in 1837-8. Ireland, however, Chartism was never able to gain widespread support, as Irish nationalist groups such as Young Ireland were more interested in campaigning against the Union and regarded Chartism as a side issue and essentially English concern. Little headway could have been made because of the Catholic Church unyielding opposition to Chartism. Chartism was never able to make headway in many areas of England. Opposition to Chartism was strong among landowners, the middle class, and important church leaders. The Bishop of Norwich was notorious for his trenchant sermons and denounced Chartist leaders as irreligious, and the whole movement as a contrary to Christian teachings. While Chartism was strong in northern towns, it had gaining much support in London. Of women in Chartism, so during its early years, women provided substantial support for Chartist movement. Women provided 1/3 of the signatures on the 1839 petition and had important, though secondary, roles in the movement. They were involved in fundraising activities in Chartist secondary schools, as well as carrying out traditional female activities such as sewing banners or organising tea parties. More significantly, there was attitude towards local shopkeepers. Many women promoted exclusive dealing, patronising shopkeepers who were known to support Chartism, while boycotting those hostile to the movement. Although there were some 100 female female Chartist associations, including 23 in Scotland, women were never considered for roles in a national movement. A few leaders were prepared to support women's political rights. However, the attitude of most Chartists was that women should limit themselves to supporting their husbands and families, and they should not engage in political activities. Women's involvement in Chartist activities declined during the 1840s, where mass meetings of 1838 and 39 were supplanted from 1840 by a National Charter Association, and women would not offer a role in its committees. They were reluctant to attend NCA meetings, which were often held in male stronghold of public houses. Women were attracted to other organisations such as religious and teetotal groups. 1848, women's adherence to Chartism had become insignificant. The only surviving photograph of the Kensington Common meeting suggests that it was an overwhelmingly masculine event. Chartism and the middle class. In the end of 1838, most middle class members had left the movement that's become concerned by the increasingly violent and aggressive tone adopted by several leading Chartists. There were attempts to expand Chartist support in the early 1840s, but when the alliances were suggested with the both Anti-Corn Law League and complete industrialists, it claimed that the repeal of the Corn Laws would benefit the agricultural interest and indeed the industrialists, because the repeal would form part of a growing trend towards free trade that would help boost the economy. They all claimed that the working class would also benefit because repeal would inevitably lower prices of bread and other foodstuffs. Many Chartists took a different view. After their disappointment over reform in 1832, they were reluctant to work with the middle class again. Some suggested that reduced bread or prices of bread would give employers an excuse to reduce wages. Members from both groups were initially keen to work together, but differences between both the two leaderships and their members meant that they could never reach clear arrangement for action. The CSU was formed in 1841 by Joseph Sturge to promote a single issue, universal male suffrage. His attempt to win Chartist support was initially successful, but faced an implacable opposition of O'Connor and the Northern Star. December of 1842, a meeting happened, attended by the CSU and Chartist representatives. Faced with the unyielding opposition of Chartist leaders and with little strong support amongst the middle class, the CSU collapsed. Chartism and trade societies. So I'll try and summarise this as quick as I can. By the late 1830s, the rise of Chartism provided an outlet for those workers who saw an organisation that could be affected by political change in areas where their own trade societies were struggling. However, the goals of many workers, trade societies and nascent unions in the Chartist movement were still aimed at improving the economic position of the working class. When the Chartist Convention of 1839 sent out a questionnaire to local associations supporting Chartism, 21 of the 23 that responded did not have general grievance over the lack of vote. Instead, they were more concerned with the hardship caused by the combination of lack of work, low pay and expensive food. Clearly, though, there were large numbers of workers who supported Chartists because, as evidenced by many hundreds of thousands of genuine signatures of the petition sent to Parliament, Chartists also played a key role in the foundation of new trade unions, using the knowledge and experience of organisations. Throughout the 1840s, Chartists were involved with the establishment of new unions or the extension of family societies and to much more overt unions. The General United Tailors Trade Protection Society and Mechanics Protective Society of Great Britain were both formed in 1844, with Chartist influence very much to the fore. These had either grown from smaller, more localised societies to national bodies, or represented an umbrella organisation for these local societies. Despite the failure of the first, second charter petitions, the experience of the Chartists in the working on a national scale towards a political end has shown them that a larger, more centralised organisation was more able to make their voices heard. How effective was the government's response to the Chartist challenge is our third question and final question. So, police forces. Peel was Home Secretary in 1829 when he introduced the Metropolitan Police, meant that the medieval system of perished officers and watchmen were replaced by single professional and uniform forces of around 1,000 men, charged with the maintaining order in London and surrounding counties. Troops could restore troops could restore order by threatening the use of armed forces. Peel believed that a trained police force could suppress disorder without having to resort to guns. Acts proved to be successful. That it was the extent by Rural Police Act in 1839, which empowered authorities in counties and in boroughs to raise their own police force. Although the introduction of royal forces developed slowly, it was proven to be effective. The electric telegraph. Information provided by government spies was often invaluable in enabling central government to arrange precautionary measures against Chartist agitation communication between spies and London. And it was inevitably very slow. This problem was overcome during the 1840s with the development of electric telegraph, proved invaluable for the 1848 when the government received information immediately about Charters' intentions and their likely strength following the rejection of their petition. Whigs' response to Charters. In 1838, the Whigs, that's supposed to say, were attacked in the press for failing to take strong action against Charters speakers who used this physical force. O'Connell was notorious for his slogans, but the language of other Chartists was even more extreme. In the years 1838 to 9, ministers took no action against Chartist speakers or writers who were open to advocating the use of violent forces. However, strong action after 1839 petition of Newport Rising happened. In 1839 to 40, some 500 Chartists were arrested throughout the country, many including prominent leaders such as, received prison in terms, and these were often for short periods of time though. The government's response in 1842 to 48, so conditions in 1842 were very different and have grown in strength since 1839, thanks to the part of movement's stronger organisation through the NCA. Troops and units of the police were sent to troubled spots, especially in New Yorkshire, and large numbers of spies were employed to discover the plans being laid by local organisations. Events of the 1848 in Britain need to be placed into a wider national European context. Third petition was presented at a time of widespread, but the government viewed the situation in Ireland as the most pressing concern. Government's response to the 1848 petitions suggests that they were very concerned about Kennington Common meeting on the 10th of April, but it's possible outcomes that they feared. And it's possible that they feared revolutionary breakouts that they might repeated in Britain. So at 2 p.m. that day, the Lord Russell wrote triumphantly to the Queen that the meeting had been proved as a complete failure. Power of state. Year 1832 had established a new political settlement that separated the property classes from the rest of society. State power was extended in the 1830s through technological change and creation of police forces outside London. Britain was not involved in European conflict at this time, so it could use armed forces to maintain domestic peace. And finally, the changing government attitude. So during the 1830s, that's supposed to say the Whigs. The Whigs had shown no interest in the working class grievance. However, Peel's government in the factories in the 1840s showed that more interest in tackling what was growing separation between the rich and the poor. Measures such as mines and factory acts showed that social change and improvement could be achieved without Chartist intervention. Significance of General Napier and the impact of the Growth Network Railway. I think she summoned this down ASAP. So Napier was appointed to command the Northern District in April 1839, with the responsibility for maintaining order during a period of Chartist unrest. He sympathised with the poverty of workers and recognised their difficulties. He believed the threat of revolution was often exaggerated. He organised his troops carefully across the north, but he avoided unnecessarily provoking Chartists. His cautious approach was shown during the sacred month of the strikes of July 1839. While many officials wanted troops delayed, he believed workers could not afford to lose wages for a long period and refused to take aggressive action. The strike quickly collapsed, helping to maintain peace and avoid a violent confrontation between Chartists and authorities. The growth of the railway network helped Chartism become a national movement by improving communication, allowing newspapers, ideas and speakers to travel easily around Britain. However, railways also strengthened the government's response to unrest, as troops could be transported rapidly to troubled spots. By late 1830s and early 1840s, railways made it much easier for authorities to suppress disturbances and maintain order.